anyone out there who's unfamiliar with Iris Wilkinson, aka Robin Hyde, could you briefly outline her work, who she was, and some of the key moments of her remarkable but tragic life?
It was remarkable and tragic and short, yes. So she was born in South Africa in 1906. She was one of, in the end, 4 girls. She was the second. And the family came to New Zealand when she was still a baby and lived in Wellington and various places around the southern suburbs. She went to school at Berhampore and Wellington Girls College. And then she left school when she was only 17 and went to work on the Dominion as a junior reporter. And that was her career for the rest of her life. She was a journalist, but she was also determined to be a writer. So even when she was at school, she'd published poems that had been highly praised in the paper. So she went on to write lots of poetry. She won competitions in the newspapers. She wrote, as well as the journalism, she wrote about 10 books altogether. But she also was dogged by tragedy. She had relationships that didn't work out. She had a stillbirth. She had a child whose existence she had to hide from almost everybody. And as an unmarried mother, that was just a situation that you didn't want to be in. So she had to try and earn a living for herself and to try and look after her son in foster care. So she struggled with all those things. She also had mental health problems, and she had a disability because she'd had a problem with her knee that doesn't really seem clear what caused it when she was a teenager. And from then on, she had a stiff knee and a limp.
She was totally remarkable.
Yeah.
Iris and Me, your book, covers most of her life, but I think it's very much focused on her time in China and the journey to China. Why did you decide to focus on that particular period of her life?
Well, originally I was going to tell the whole story, which I have done a little bit in flashbacks, but that was just too big. And the story of her trip to China is just part of her life that hasn't been much told. People have concentrated really on her life in New Zealand and her life in England, but the bit in the middle is often glossed over in just a few sentences. So partly because it was really unusual, and the more I found out about it, the more astonishing it seemed. And also because we'd been to China ourselves, my husband and I, in the 80s when it had only just opened up to tourists. And I felt that a lot of it was, even though it was 50 years later, a lot of it still seemed quite similar out in the countryside. I think it must have been still quite similar.
You use a hidden mystery narrator to tell the story, and we're not going to reveal who the mystery narrator is, but can I ask you, why did you decide on that particular approach?
So I'm trying very hard not to reveal the narrator as well. So it was just a lot of thinking about point of view. So my first thought was I could tell it first person from Robin Hyde's own point of view, but I only thought about that for like 5 minutes because that just wouldn't work, because she had her own voice and I didn't want to try and speak in her voice. So then I thought I could have done it third person, but that seemed quite impersonal. But the problem was, although she had family and she did have friends, but she set off for China by herself. So I just had to do a lot of thinking about how I could tell the story, but making it quite close to her. And then when I finally figured it out, it seemed very obvious, and I thought that the book would work that way.
Yeah, it's very clever. It's very clever to do it that way. I found the book a compulsive read, and I found myself very quickly lost in the locations and the time. And I really liked a lot of the period details. So what I really, they were done with a delicate touch. It didn't feel like you were reading a historical tome. How did you go about researching the period details and working them into the story?
Thank you. I think I often fall into the trap of putting too much of my research in the books that I write. So I was determined not to do that this time. And I think because China was so astonishing to her and everything was so different, and even to us looking back at that time, it just seems such a long ago time. I don't think you need a lot of details to capture how strange, it seemed to her. I think you just need a few well-chosen details. So some of them I got out of her own writing, but I also read about, especially about other New Zealand women who were in China at the same time. They were nurses, and there was somebody who worked for the YWCA, and they left lots of letters and other writing. So reading their letters that were written at the same time about being in a different part of China, that was really interesting. And just reading up about the Sino-Japanese War that I knew nothing about. Werry, who was a famous New Zealander who was there, and just in general China, and also our own memories of it, I think, because especially when she was on the trains, that just felt really familiar, because I think I read some really interesting stuff, about the China railways. That was really fascinating. So just coming at it from lots of different angles, I think. Yeah,
I thought it worked really well. I mean, The Godwit's Fly is her most famous novel, and it's autobiographical. But what struck me about it, I went back and reread it for this interview, is it's written in a very impressionistic and vivid and lush style, I kind of thought. And in The Iris and Me, you've employed a prose poetry style, which I think evokes Iris's kind of the texture of her writing really well. Can you talk us why you took that approach? Was it deliberate? Were you thinking about Iris's writing when you said, that would work well to talk about her life?
Oh, thank you again. It all the way that I came to this book is a lot of different angles that connected together. So I did want to write a verse novel, and I think verse novels work for this kind of biographical, maybe emotional topics, because they strain away a lot of the extraneous stuff, and they just get down to the real basics of it. And I think also because I'd read a lot of Iris Robin's writing, I did pick up phrases here and there, or ways that she said things. For example, in one of the diaries she writes that she said phooey about something. So I worked that in, but I had the narrator hearing her saying phooey about something. So I tried to make it close to her. But I think there's something about verse novels or prose poetry that's just a different way of telling stories, but it gets the emotion through, I think.
Iris and Me has been published at the same time as The Uppish Hen and Other Poems, which of course was a previously unpublished collection of poems that she wrote for her son Derek. Can you tell us about the importance of that collection of poetry in her life? Because it had a very important and special meaning in her life, that collection of poetry. It's great to see it finally being published to the general public.
So she wrote the poems for his son when she set off through China on that trip. His son was still only about 8, I think, and she'd never been able to live with him. He'd always been in foster care, except for a very few weeks. So she'd see him as much as she could. If she could afford it, she'd buy some extra bits of clothing for him. But she had a dream that eventually they'd be able to live together, and that was partly why she was going to England, to try and make more money with her publishing. So I feel that was one thing that she could give him. When she couldn't give him a lot of money, she couldn't give him a home. She could only give him scraps of her time, but she could give him her writing. So she wrote the poems that were specially for him, and that's such a special gift that she did give him. And I think he treasured them. He understood the meaning behind them. Yeah.
Why do you think it's taken so long for her work to get the credit and attention it truly deserves? I mean, it's a really obvious question, but it's quite a big question about her.
Yeah, I think it's partly, I think there's a lot of different aspects to it. When she died alone overseas with no money, so she didn't come from a wealthy family, and she didn't have an influential backer in the same way that you might think that Catherine Mansfield had John Middleton Murray, who edited all her letters, even if maybe she didn't want that, and put together all the collections for her. She didn't have anybody like that. She had some friends that were, supporters, like John A. Lee was one of them, the MP, and a few others, but she didn't have anybody that would really stand up for her like that. And it was also a time when women writers were often looked at quite condescendingly by some of the other male writers of the time. Also, there was World War II that took over, so a lot of her books just got lost over the next few years because World War II took over everything. So I think there were a whole lot of things like that meant that she just disappeared a little bit from view.
It's really, it is one of the many tragedies in her life. In this conversation, we're switching between Irish and Robin, and they're basically two sides of the same person. But kind of reading a little bit further into it, do you think that each has distinctive dimension? For example, I did read that she signed a suicide note with both names, which is a strange thing to do if one's just your pen name.
Yeah, I would have to check that because I haven't heard that about the suicide note before, although I'm sure it's true. But so she adopted that pen name when she came back from Australia after having the stillbirth, or the baby that died soon after birth. And she'd given him a name, which was Christopher Robin Hyde. And then she went to Hanmer Springs, it was a hospital then for returned servicemen to help them get over the shell shock and problems like that. But it was also turning into a hospital for other people. And she started to write again there, and that was where she adopted the pen name, which was Robin Hyde. So I think maybe it was a way that she could acknowledge that child to people, that she could give him some kind of life, even though he didn't have a life, but she could continue his memory.
I mean, reading through about her life and stuff, I was wondering what you'd think if she was alive today, how she would be regarded, because I think a lot of it's the prejudices of her time that really hold her back and cause a lot of the tragedies in her life. It's not her, it's circumstances beyond her.
Now, if you just think that, a few years later Social Security came in, and, if there'd been a benefit for unmarried mothers, or if as a woman she could have had the unemployment benefit, because women had to pay into it but didn't get it if they lost their job. So even those two things would have made just such a big difference to her. And her voice is surprisingly modern in some of the writing. A lot of the writing that you read from the 20s and 30s feels very dated, but I don't think hers feels dated.
No,
it still feels very modern.
I think that impressionist thing gives it that modern feel. Yeah. Can you tell us about the rediscovery of Iris and where her works rightfully sit in the New Zealand literary canon? I mean, I was shocked to discover that the Godwit's Fly was published in 1938 in the UK and kind of largely disappeared there, but wasn't actually published in New Zealand until the 1970s.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting because we just talked about, didn't we, how she disappeared from view. But I think there have always been some people who've been interested in her, little pockets of people, and I think over the years they've gradually found each other. But one thing that made a big difference was in the early 2000s, several people applied for a Marsden Fund grant. So the Marsden Fund is usually for science, but they expanded it to cover the humanities. And there were out of that funding, there were 3 books that came out of it. And one was The Book of Iris, which is the very hefty biography of her, written by her son Derek. Well, it had a complicated backstory, but he's the author. So The Book of Iris was one, and that covered her whole life, had lots of photographs, and that came out in 2002, I think, and was shortlisted for the Book Awards. So that was big. And then I think there was also a collection of her autobiographical writing, and I think the third one was a collection of her poems. So that was 3 quite big books that came out in the early 2000s. And also I think maybe even earlier than that, there was kind of a move to rediscover some of those forgotten women writers. There were publishers that were republishing some of the books, so that was part of it. And even the Wellington Writers' Walk, I think you could say maybe made a difference, because she was one of the very first ones who was on the first group of sculptures, and that was 2002 when they were unveiled. And even in the last few years, there have been several books about her. There's been Gregory Can put out a book of poetry, and there's been a photographic book. And you can go online and find blog articles about, I found one about somebody who'd visited her grave in London, and another lovely one about the history of the typewriter that she probably used. So
She was very attached to that typewriter.
yeah, so just lots of little pockets of interest that I think have coalesced over the years.
Do you think that process is finished? Do you think that there's still more recognition that she's due to be given?
Maybe there could be. I think I'm sure there's probably more that you could say.
Yeah. Her adult life, as we've kind of touched upon, was marked by lots of things: mental illness, disability, but also I think positive stuff like she was very brave, and she had the desire to travel and journey, both in the physical sense and as an individual, as a person. I was wondering, do you have any kind of inkling of what fueled that drive?
Yeah.
Incredible drive behind her.
It was. I think that must just have been the sort of person that she was. Like, she was always desperate to be a writer. She was so determined to be a writer. And so maybe she was just determined to tell stories, and she knew that some of these stories she could tell well.
Mm-hmm.
So she did a series of articles for the Railways magazine that you can find online, and went all over the country and wrote about them, which was like exploring the country and telling people what it's like. But all the other writing that she did as well, a lot of it was just, it's so varied. So she just seemed to have a huge interest in lots of different aspects of life, and this desire to express it in writing. And she was quite, I don't think she would have been the easiest person always to live with or to be with. She was quite prickly. She had ups and downs in her friendships. But that was maybe part of that burning desire inside her to experience things and write about them. And I think she just had a spark of some kind of boldness inside her that made her
it comes out a lot.
brave enough to try new things. Yeah.
We've talked about Goblet's Fly, and it's regarded as her masterpiece, and it's obviously semi-autobiographical. And I was reading about how it started life as a therapeutic exercise while she was living in the grounds of an Auckland mental hospital. Can you tell us a little bit more about its creation? Because it's a fascinating kind of origin story.
Yeah, really interesting. So I think 1933 she was working on the Observer in Auckland, so that's the middle of the Depression, and she lost her job at very short notice, and because she was a woman she didn't get the unemployment benefit, and if she had no pay she wouldn't be able to pay to keep her son in foster care, so that was a big disaster for her. So that was when she made a suicide attempt, and after that she ended up living in what was called the Grey Lodge, which was part of Auckland Mental Hospital, and later it was known as Carrington, and now it's part of Unitec. So the building is still there. And she lived there for several years, and two of the doctors in particular encouraged her to start writing again, and one was the psychiatrist and one was the medical super. And I think that they recognised how important writing was to her, and they suggested it as a kind of a therapy exercise, which maybe was quite new at that time, the idea that you could write things down and make sense of what had happened to you by putting them in writing. So that was what she started to do, and I think not just because they encouraged her, but also because she had that safe place to live, and even though it wasn't an ideal place to live, but she was safe, and she could concentrate on her writing. They gave her her own little attic room where she could sit with her typewriter.
We've talked about how her life's full of tragedy, but this is a young adult novel. How did you manage to navigate being able to tell the truth and be true to the truth while also not making the book too dark? Because this book could be really dark, but it's not. I mean, it's not a dark book to read at all. Irison is not dark.
I'm glad you think that, because with my books I always try and end them with some kind of note of hope, and of course obviously her life ended quite sadly. So, and originally when I wrote the book I took I took the book right to the very end of her life.
Mhm.
But then I took that out because it was too hard to write, let alone read. So I think the hope in it comes from everything that she achieved, but also I think there were other themes that kind of came out of it as I was writing it, and one important one was something to do with friendship, which is to do with the narrator, really. So for me that kind of lightens the story, the way that it's told using that narrator, and also some of the happy memories that are embedded in it. I think give it more of a lightness. It is tricky when you're navigating writing especially for young adults, to try and get that balance right, because they can actually understand and process a lot more than sometimes we give them credit for. But yeah, it's just how you express that, really.
I mean, especially the bit between the Chinese and Japanese War and the atrocities going on. It's kind of, you allude to the tragedies and massacres without, detailing them in detail.
Yeah, there's a lot more that you could say about that, because it was just, I mean, I knew nothing about the Sino-Japanese War and what happened in it was just awful. And we still know very little about it, really.
Philippa, I have just one last question for you. You obviously love and admire Iris Robin, both as a writer and I suspect as a person. Can you tell us where that appreciation lies, where it originated, and why others should feel the same about her?
I think she was a remarkable person and a really good writer. I kind of relate to her on a personal level in some ways, just from growing up in Wellington and living in the same kind of areas as she did, and that burning want she had to be a writer. I kind of remember feeling that as a young person, or even an older person. And I just think she's what she did and achieved in her life is amazing, and also because she wrote across such a wide variety of genres. So she, especially the poetry, because she wanted to be thought of as a poet, but also all her journalism, and the novels are historical, and there's fantasy, and there's the memoir, and a war novel that you'd think she'd been at the front lines in World War One. So there's just such a range that I think anybody would find something in there that would be of interest to them.
Thank you very much for that, Philippa. That was excellent.
Thank you, and thank you for reading the book with such attention.